The hike was long, nearly 6 miles. The first 5 were easy enough, but the last mile was a series of constant switchbacks on a steep slope that left me gasping for air with each step. We were exhausted and drenched in sweat, but in good spirits when we finally arrived at the top of the ridge shortly before sunset. My friends seemed eager to explore the nearby landscape, and I shared their enthusiasm. From what we had heard, the view here was stunning. It was our annual summer camping trip, a rigid tradition that had endured since childhood. My family, and the families of my 3 best friends, who also happened to be my neighbors, spent a week in the park every summer. It was a serene environment that allowed one to shed their stress, their worries, and all the troubles of the previous year. Here, next to the sprawling forests of pines and under the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, we came to forget the problems of life and simply enjoyed ourselves. I had many fond memories of this place that spanned throughout my childhood, fishing and swimming in lakes, marshmallows and ghost stories over the campfire, and hiking along the many trails that covered the park. I looked forward to this trip each and every year. However, this year was slightly different. Our families had stayed at the usual campgrounds while Tony, Astor, Margaret, and I hiked on to a different area. For many years, we had been told that there was a campground on top of a ridge that offered an absolutely incredible view of the valley below. On more than a few occasions, my friends and I had begged our parents to take us there, but we could never convince them to make the long hike. For our younger siblings, 6 miles was simply too far to walk. At least, that was the excuse they used. Nevertheless, we had collectively convinced our parents to allow us to make the hike alone this year. They had agreed that we were definitely old enough to camp out on our own, and wished us well on our journey. Now here we were, 5 hours later, on top of the heavily forested ridge and excited to pitch our tents. As soon as we reached the top of the ridge, the dirt path leveled off. There were pine trees on either side of the path that cast long shadows in the evening sun. About 100 yards ahead, the other edge of the ridge could be seen, and we picked up our pace in anticipation of the view. I noticed that there was a small building at the edge of the path that was built very close to the cliff. It looked like a house, and I curiously wondered who would be living up here. Turning my mind back towards the reason we were here, I hurried past the house with my friends and arrived at the opposite edge of the ridge. The view was everything we had anticipated. The setting sun illuminated the valley below us. The August grass shone gold and waved with the light breeze that swept through the valley. A few wisps of clouds gently floated through the sky and were illuminated red by the dying beams of sunlight. I heard Astor and Margaret gasp in awe as they admired the landscape. Tony and I stood in silent appreciation, taking in the beauty. We must have stood there for close to 10 minutes, as the sun sank ever lower towards the horizon. We were so hypnotized that we failed to notice the man behind us. As soon as I turned around, I saw him. An old man. He looked perhaps 70, and he sat in a chair, smoking a cigarette on the porch of the building I had seen earlier. He was looking at us with an amused expression on his face as he puffed away. Feeling a little embarrassed that all 4 of us had walked past him without so much as a good evening, I decided to approach him and introduce myself. His eyes locked on me as I walked up to his front porch. "Good evening," I said in a friendly tone. "Damn right it is," the old man immediately responded, taking another drag on his cigarette. I was a little startled by his forwardness, but I smiled and introduced myself. "My name's Chris Harding," I said as I extended a hand to him. The old man pulled a tobacco-stained hand out of his right pocket and gave me a good, firm handshake. Walter McNeil," he said with a smile. "These are my friends, Astor, Tony, and Margaret," I said, pointing to each of them. "Sorry for not noticing you earlier." Walter waved his hand in a dismissive manner. "It's all right. That view is a lot prettier than me." He chuckled. My friends and I chuckled along with him. I liked his sense of humor. "We've never been up here before, and we didn't know anybody had a house up here. What makes you live here?" I asked. Walter held out his hand, palm upwards, pointing towards the scenery behind us. His eyebrows were raised in amusement, and I immediately felt stupid for asking such an obvious question. "Oh, yeah, that's some view, isn't it?" I responded. "It is, ain't it? Best time the whole damn year, actually. You wouldn't want to be here in January. Winters are something fierce," he stated. "Do you live here alone?" Just me. Been here my whole life, and I don't ever plan on moving." "So you grew up around here?" "Sure did. Used to be a little town down in that valley. That's where I was born and raised." "What happened to it?" I inquired. "The town, why isn't it there anymore?" "Well, nothing happened to it, as much as it just withered away. All the young folk of my time moved on. Didn't want to live their lives in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere," Walter said with a touch of sadness in his voice. "But not you? You didn't want to go anywhere?" "Nah, not me. Perfectly happy to be here till I'm dead." Walter said nothing further and seemed to go deep into thought. We stood around awkwardly for close to a minute before finally deciding to say goodbye and head to the camping area. We were tired from our hike and still needed to pitch our tents for sleeping. "Excuse me," I said, waking Walter from his silent contemplation. "How do we get to the campgrounds from here?" "Huh? Campgrounds? Oh, just follow that trail there for about half a mile. It goes along the ridge and it'll lead you straight to a clearing where you can set up camp. You'll have the place all to yourselves. Hardly anybody comes up here anymore." Walter pointed to the right of his house, and our eyes followed his finger. There was a thin dirt path leading into the trees. "Okay, thanks for your help, Mr. McNeil," I said. We waved goodbye to him and started to turn towards the trail. Just as my head turned away from the house, something caught my eye. It was another trail, even thinner, that led into the trees on the left side of the house. "Where does that trail lead?" I asked, nodding my head towards the other path. Walter glanced over towards it, and a smile crept onto his lips. He took a drag on his cigarette before responding. "Oh, that trail? It leads to the stairway," he said casually. "The what?" "The stairway. That's what everyone calls it. I don't think it has a proper name." "What's the stairway?" I inquired, genuinely curious. "It's the damn strangest thing I ever saw. Just a set of stairs carved out of rock. Goes right out over the cliff. Been there just about forever." "What?" I asked incredulously. "A stairway made out of rock right over the cliff?" Exactly that. You gotta see it to believe it, but it's there." "Who built it? Why would anyone build something like that?" "Well, about 10 years ago, these archaeologists came up here to look at it. They got a load of fancy tools and such. One of them tells me that it's nearly 900 years old, if you can believe it. So I guess the Injuns must have built it. There sure as hell wasn't anybody else here 900 years ago." "I see. Why did the Native Americans build it?" I asked. "I ain't nobody got a clue. Hell, those archaeologists couldn't even tell how they built it. Said it looked like the staircase was carved straight out of the rock, but the way it sticks over the side of the ridge, there couldn't have been any mountain to carve it out of. In fact, it's a damn miracle it hasn't fallen over. Shouldn't even be standing with how it is," Walter explained. At least that's what the archaeologists say. The way he emphasized the word archaeologist made it clear that Walter was not telling the full story and was merely waiting for us to ask him to elaborate. I decided to humor him. After all, he clearly didn't get many visitors. So, what do other people say? Walter's face lit up in honest excitement as he was given the opportunity to tell a story. His cigarette was nearly gone and he threw the butt on the ground before pulling a new one from his pocket. As he lit it with a match, he looked at us and asked, "You kids like ghost stories?" "Sure, we love ghost stories," Aster exclaimed. The rest of us nodded in agreement. Many ghost stories had been swapped between our families over a campfire, and a fresh one was always welcome. "Well, pull up your pants and get ready, 'cause I got one hell of a story for you," Walter said as he puffed his new cigarette. "So there's this god, you see. It rules over this land and—" "Is this a Native American legend?" Margaret cut him off. "Tell you the truth, miss, I don't know. Very well could be, but I don't got a clue where it came from. This is just a story I heard as a boy. Jimmy Dwight's granddad used to tell it when he was drunk as hell and couldn't keep his old mouth shut." Walter laughed hard, and his laughter turned into a wheeze, which turned into a coughing fit that lasted several minutes. When he finally composed himself, he continued with the story. "So, anyways, there's a god that rules over this land, and he's got these spirits under his command, and these spirits, they got a job. When somebody's close to death, when their time has come, so to speak, these spirits go to the dying man and they help him along. They take him and show him the way to the next life. So they're good spirits, you see. They help people go peacefully." Walter ruminated for a moment. It looked as if he was having trouble remembering the story. "So, anyways, what was I saying? Oh yeah, there's the good spirits that take dying people away. Except one of these spirits was actually no good. He didn't do his job right. He liked it when people died, you see. There was something about it, something about death he liked. So he starts taking people when it ain't their time. Healthy people, young people, people that got no business dying. And this bad spirit, he's killing them, just for the sake of killing. Ain't that awful?" "Yeah, sounds real bad," Tony agreed. "This mean spirit, he goes around killing people for no good reason. And the killing seems to give him power, makes him stronger. So the god figures that this can't go on any longer. So he banishes him. Bad spirit gets thrown right out of God's realm. Heaven, you could call it. He lands on his ass right in this area. And most of his power's gone too, but not all." "So the evil spirit is still here, roaming around? Is that it?" Aster asked. "You're ahead of me, young lady," Walter responded. "As I said, most of the bad spirit's power is gone, but not all. He's still got some juices left, and like I said, killing makes him stronger, so he keeps on killing. Except he doesn't bother with individuals no more. That ain't no fun. He likes groups of people, groups he can play with. He taunts them, like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it. And the more the people suffer before they die, the more power he gets. And what does he use this power for, you ask? Well, he uses it to build that damn stairway. Every time he does some poor group of people in, he heads on over to that staircase and uses the power to add an extra step to it. In fact, it's his power that keeps the stairway from falling over. He's been building that staircase for close to 1,000 years. He's a patient little bastard. He's building it upwards, so that one day he can get back to heaven and have his revenge." Walter laughed hard again, but thankfully his laughter did not degenerate into another coughing fit. How's that for a stairway to heaven? I chuckled at the reference, but I was also impressed by Walter's story. It certainly was a rather creepy tale, and it seemed perfectly tailored to scare us. An evil spirit roaming these lands, only preying on groups of people such as us. What an excellent ghost story. And how many steps are on this stairway now? How many groups have come up here and met with a terrible fate? I asked with an amused tone. There's Walter trailed off. Huh, well, I'll be damned if I haven't forgot. I went out on that stairway when I was young and counted the steps. But that was so long ago, I can't remember at all how many steps there are. Of course, you're free to go and find out yourselves. Walter's coy offer piqued my interest, and I found that it also interested my friends. He told us that the trail leading to the stairway was only a few hundred yards long, and that we would still have time to see it before the sun set. It didn't take much convincing to get us on the path to see the legendary set of stairs. My mouth hung open in shock. It was exactly as Walter had described it. Even so, I was still completely blown away by what I saw. A large staircase made entirely of gray rock was jutting out over the edge of the ridge. It was steep and had no support as far as I could tell. It looked as if it should fall over at any second. I could tell that my friends were as amazed as I was. I had never seen anything like it in my life. Walter had understated things when he called it the damn strangest thing he ever saw. We silently stared at the stone monstrosity for a long time. The sun was starting to touch the horizon when Tony spoke. How many? How many what? I responded. How many steps are there? Count them. I'm sure as hell not walking out on that thing. All four of us began counting the stone steps in our heads as the remaining rays of sunlight illuminated the stairway. I lost count once and had to start over. 39, Margaret declared. Tony and Astor agreed with her count. I was the last one to finish my tally of the stairs, and I arrived at the same conclusion. 39, I agreed. 39 groups of people, killed by the evil spirit that haunts these lands, Tony said in an overdone, spooky voice. We laughed, and Astor mentioned that we should all tell our parents about this place as soon as the week was over. We had a great ghost story to share. The sun finally dipped below the horizon and left behind only a bloody red sky. We decided to head back towards Walter's house and take the path to the campground, promising ourselves that we would come back to see the stairway at least once before the week was over. The walk to the campground was fairly uneventful. We saw Walter again as we passed by his house and told him that there were 39 steps on the stairway. He mumbled something along the lines of, "Sounds about right," before bidding us good night and heading into his house. It took less than 15 minutes to walk the half-mile path to the camping area. In the fading light, we chatted and did our best to spook each other with dreadful stories of the evil spirit that lurked in these woods. About halfway through the walk, Tony spotted the dirty skeleton of a squirrel laying just off the path. Astor, the most squeamish member of our group, had been unwilling to so much as look at it, so Tony had picked up the skull and chased her with it, laughing as she let out angry cries of disgust. Margaret scolded him like a mother, warning him that he would get all sorts of diseases from animal carcasses. But Tony didn't seem to care. He chased Astor with the skull for most of the walk before finally tossing it on the ground and kicking it into the trees. It was these types of antics that I missed and so dearly looked forward to each year as I camped with my friends. The campground was merely a clearing in the woods. It was uneven ground, a long and narrow scar in the woods that followed the high ridge we were upon. There were 3 fire pits lined up in a nice row, along with room for 3 groups to set up camp. We had the entire place to ourselves. We were seasoned experts at pitching tents, and Tony and I had a race against Astor and Margaret to see who could pitch their tent faster. Tony and I won by just a few seconds, and the girls cried foul because the ground beneath their tents was rockier and harder to drive a stake into. We all had a good laugh over it. The tent that Tony and I were using was closest to the trail, and Margaret and Astor's was directly opposite ours, with a fire pit in between us. In the cool night air, we built a bright campfire and cooked hot dogs on a stick, each of us taking turns to come up with a new ghost story. From the position of the moon, I could tell that it was easily past midnight when we finally decided to crawl into our tents and drift into sleep, exhausted from the long hike. The next day was wonderful. There were no clouds in the sky, and a gentle breeze swept through the trees, keeping us cool with the hot August sun above. We passed the time in bliss, exploring the nearby woods. Margaret stumbled upon a small, pretty stream not far from camp, and we must have spent 2 hours sitting there with our feet in the refreshing cold water. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to say anything. We were as content as we had ever been. The day, so far, had been perfect. Unfortunately, that perfection would not last. It was evening, and Tony was building the campfire. Margaret had gone into the woods to go to the bathroom or something, and Astor sat directly behind Tony, watching him toss wood into the fire. I had just entered our tent to retrieve the hot dogs for our meal when I heard Tony scream. It was a clear scream of pain that echoed through the woods and jolted me upright. Rushing outside, I saw Tony lying on the ground next to the roaring fire. His cries of agony had ceased, and he now clutched his left hand to his chest, biting his lower lip and taking deep, even breaths. I could see that the side of his left hand, from his pinky finger to his wrist, was an angry shade of red and covered in blisters. I immediately knew that Tony had burned himself. As an experienced camper, I was accustomed to such emergencies, and I quickly ran back into our tent. We had brought a first aid kit that included burn ointment. I was rummaging through my backpack searching for the cream when Tony began cussing. "Astor, what the fuck did you do that for?" Tony cursed. There was clear anger in his voice. What? I heard Astor stutter. "Why the fuck did you push me?" I found the burn cream and some bandages and stepped back outside the tent to see what the problem was. Tony's face had become red with rage, and Astor stood with a shocked expression on her face. Tony looked at me while pointing at Astor accusingly. "Chris, that bitch tried to push me into the fire." I was confused by the accusation that Tony was making. I turned my head to look at Astor, who was pale with shock, then looked back at Tony. "Tony, what are you saying?" I asked as I walked over to him and bent down to apply the ointment to his hand. I could see that there was no charring of the skin, which meant that the burns were only second degree. That was good. The hand would heal fully. "She pushed me. She fucking pushed me towards the fire and I got burned," he hissed with venom in his voice. Tony winced as I wrapped a bandage around his hand. I was disturbed by what he was saying. Tony had always been the most level-headed member of our group. I didn't understand why he was accusing Astor of hurting him. "Tony, you just fell down. You tripped and stuck your hand in the fire. That's all that happened," I said calmly. "Don't blame Astor." I was pushed. I felt it. Someone pushed me really hard right in the back. I didn't fucking trip. I know someone pushed me. Margaret isn't here and you were in the tent, but Astor was right behind me the whole time. She definitely pushed me. I looked back at Astor and could tell that she was close to crying. I had known her since I was a toddler, and she was one of the sweetest people I have ever met. There was no way, absolutely no way, that she had tried to push Tony into the fire. "Tony, why would she do that? Why would Astor push you into a fire? think about what you're saying. I tried to rationalize. I don't know. Maybe she's mad. Mad about the squirrel skull I chased her with. Yeah, she was mad about that and wanted revenge. Aster choked back a sob. Tony, I would never do that. Push you into a fire, that's horrible. I'm sorry about your hand, but... Yeah, sorry that my head didn't go into the fire instead. Tony sneered back. I'm lucky I caught my balance and only touched some embers. I nearly lost my fucking face. Aster burst into tears and ran into her tent. I could hear her sobbing into her sleeping bag. Now I was angry, and I turned to Tony. What the hell is wrong with you? Why did you make Aster cry? I asked Tony in an angry tone. Because she... Shut up. Shut up and think about it. You've known Aster as long as I have. Have you ever seen her do something mean? Even once in her life? Tony's face softened, and his eyes fell down to the ground. Well, no, I haven't, but nothing. You're being ridiculous. Aster didn't push you into the fire. Nobody pushed you. You just fell. Go apologize to Aster for making her cry. Now. I had always been the strong voice of command in our group. Tony agreed and went into the tent to apologize to Aster. But not before insisting that someone had pushed him into that fire one last time. Margaret returned from the woods and we filled her in on what happened to Tony. She suggested that we should cut our trip short and get him to a doctor. But Tony was completely against the idea. He insisted that the burn was not serious. The cream and bandages kept his hand from hurting badly, and there was no point in ruining the trip, he said. And so, with Tony and Aster on good terms again, we fell asleep in our tents and spent another cool, pleasant night on the ridge. I woke to screaming. Not a scream of pain, but a scream of fear. It was high and shrill, jolting me upright from a deep sleep. Even before I stepped out of my tent, I knew that it was Aster. Only she could produce such a sharp cry from her vocal cords. The sun had just begun to rise, sending fresh beams of sunlight through the trees. I wearily stumbled out of the tent, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Our tents and the grass were covered with sparkling dew, but I had no time to admire the beauty of early morning. Becoming more alert, I noticed that Aster was standing in the entrance to her tent with her hands over her mouth. Margaret had been awakened by the sudden scream and stood behind her. Both of them were looking towards the ground in front of their tent. I followed their gaze and could see that something was laid out in the dirt. I walked around the fire pit towards the girl's tent in order to get a look at what had caused Aster to cry out. I approached the tent and focused on the object in the dirt. When I could clearly see what it was, I recoiled in disgust. It was a squirrel skull. And not just the skull, the entire skeleton was there as well, laid out in a sickening pose that made it appear to be dancing. It looked exactly like the squirrel skeleton we had seen on the first night, except this skeleton was clean. Its bones were white and did not have a single speck of dirt on them, as if somebody had scrubbed each and every one, carefully making sure that any impurities were removed, leaving nothing but a shiny white pile of bones, perfectly laid out in front of Aster's tent. Aster continued to gasp in horror and disgust as Tony stepped out of our tent and walked towards us with a concerned look on his face. "What's wrong? What's going on?" he asked. Aster wrenched her gaze from the skeleton and looked at Tony as he approached. In no time at all, the expression on her face turned from terror to anger. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Aster screamed hysterically. "As if you don't fucking know!" Tony looked confused. He stood next to me and peered down at the ground, seeing the skeleton for the first time. "You're such a fucking asshole, Tony. I thought we made up last night. You said you were sorry for blaming me. What a fucking liar. Fuck you. I absolutely agreed with Aster. It was one thing for Tony to be paranoid and believe that he had been pushed into the fire. But now, he had taken things too far. Taking the skeleton that he had tormented Aster with earlier and placing it outside her tent was just cruel. It was clear to everyone that he had done this in a petty attempt to exact revenge for the perceived assault Aster had committed. I got angry. Extremely angry. I turned to Tony. I was about to tell him off, to go on a tirade against him, to cuss him out for being such a thoughtless, paranoid asshole. I opened my mouth to begin my rant, and then immediately closed my lips and swallowed back my words when I saw his face. He had taken a step back from the skeleton. His face had gone pale, and his hands were clenched into tight fists. I could see the tension in his arms and neck. He was afraid. Truly, sincerely afraid. Aster continued to curse at Tony. After several moments, he turned his wide eyes towards her and looked her in the face. All he could manage was a barely audible squeak. I didn't do this, Tony whispered as his voice cracked. Oh, sure you didn't, Aster replied sarcastically. No, the skeleton just walked up here on its own and sat itself down in front of my tent. You're a lying asshole. That's all you are. A lying asshole. Aster ran back into her tent sobbing. Margaret said nothing and only scowled at Tony before returning to the tent to console Aster. And in that moment, I became afraid. Tony wasn't lying. There was genuine fear etched across his face. He had not placed that skeleton outside the tent. That I felt sure of. And I sure as hell hadn't put it there. And Aster clearly didn't. She wouldn't even look at such a thing, let alone touch it. That left only Margaret. But what motive did she have? She never liked practical jokes. And this had far exceeded what was appropriate for a joke. I knew Tony was having the same thoughts that I was. He turned towards me and opened his mouth. But before he could speak, I shook my head and said, "Don't look at me. I didn't put it there." Tony's face grew paler. He gave a short nod of understanding and went back to our tent, mumbling something about getting breakfast ready. I stepped into the girls' tent and tried to help calm Aster down. I told her that I honestly thought Tony hadn't put the skeleton there, but she could not be reasoned with. In between bouts of crying, she kept repeating, "Somebody put it there. Somebody put it there." The rest of the day went by without any more incidents, but the damage had already been done. Aster refused to speak to Tony and hardly left her tent. Margaret again suggested that we cut the trip short, and this time I agreed. I was unsettled, to say the least, and wanted nothing more than to get the hell away from this place. There was something going on here, something no good, and I did not care to find out what it was. That evening, we ate our dinner in silence. Aster remained in her tent and spoke to only Margaret. Before the sun had set, we were all in our tents, attempting to fall asleep. The plan was to wake at the crack of dawn, pack up our supplies, and leave. Nobody wanted to stay here any longer. As I lay in the tent next to Tony, wrapped in my sleeping bag and waiting for sleep to take hold, my mind wandered in the manner that minds are prone to do. For a moment, just a brief moment, I allowed myself to consider the unthinkable. He likes groups of people, groups he can play with. He taunts them like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it, and the more the people suffer before they die, the more power he gets. That was what the old man, Walter McNeil, had said, wasn't it? Well, here they were, a group of 4 people out in the woods, and there was certainly suffering going on. Tony's hand looked like a fried lobster. Aster was an emotional wreck that couldn't stop sobbing. Margaret and Aster were angry at Tony, and Tony and I were scared to death because we knew that we had not put the skeleton outside the tent. I shivered and pushed the thought away. Here I was, letting an old man's ghost story get to me, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it away completely. The subtle fear remained, the constant what if in the back of my mind. I remembered what Aster had kept repeating this morning. Somebody put it there. And what had Tony said the day before? Somebody pushed me. Somebody or something. And with that thought, sleep took me. There exists a sound so monstrous, so utterly horrid, that no human ear should ever suffer through it. It's a sound that woke me from my uneasy sleep and infected my soul, spreading absolute terror throughout every limb. The moment I heard it, my entire body went numb. I was paralyzed with fear. Truly paralyzed, I could not move my body. To twitch even a muscle was a task as impossible as gliding through the air like a bird. No words in the English language exist that can describe this sound. The closest description I can give is the noise of 100 bloodthirsty wolves howling at the moon, sent through an audio distorter, like the kind used at rock concerts, and then played back at maximum volume. The ground beneath my sleeping bag was vibrating, and it felt as if the hounds of hell walked the earth around me. That was the sound that ended my slumber. I felt Tony next to me, as rigid as I was. I couldn't even so much as move my lips to cry out in fear, though. No sooner had the sound started before it ended, leaving behind a horrible silence. Then, a new sound took its place. Much quieter, much less bone-chilling, but horrible nonetheless. It was the sound of Margaret screaming. I snapped out of my paralysis. My body was free again. Tony bolted upright next to me. My left hand went down to the tent floor next to my sleeping bag, blindly searching for the flashlight I always kept beside me. When I found it, I grabbed it and ran out of the tent. Fire. That was the first thing I saw. The brown summer grass around us was on fire. I knew that we had left embers smoldering in the fire pit before we retired to our tents. But there was at least 5 feet of dirt surrounding the pit. The embers couldn't have accidentally started this blaze. I looked across from our tent and saw that the girls' tent had collapsed. I ran straight towards it, running through the smoking, fiery grass that surrounded us. Margaret's wails continued, but they seemed to be getting further away. Aster was still in the tent, thrashing around and yelling for help. I got there and picked up the fabric, allowing her to exit. When I raised the tent back up, I saw that the backside had been torn to shreds. 4 long gash marks ran across the entire side. "It got her! It took Margaret! It took her!" Aster cried. Her words were barely understandable through her hysterical sobs of terror. I shined my flashlight over the tent and across the clearing, and my blood ran cold. Margaret screamed as she was dragged across the ground. She was being pulled feet first into the forest, her head scraping against the rough, stony ground. I caught only a brief glimpse of the thing that had her leg. It was dark, pure black. It was a person, or a beast, or both. I couldn't tell. It had no defined form. It was like a shadow, except even less than a shadow. It had no substance, no depth. It looked like a 2-dimensional drawing of a monster. Margaret disappeared into the pine forest, but her screams continued. Somehow, through all the fear, terror, and shock I felt, I was still able to run. A sort of blind fury overtook me. Now I wasn't just afraid. Now I was angry. Angry at that thing that tormented my friends, that had taken Margaret from her tent as she slept. I ran, faster than I'd ever run before. I sprinted after Margaret, forgetting about Tony and Astor. The only thing that mattered was saving Margaret from the dark beast that had her. I tore across the clearing and into the trees, following Margaret's screams. I held my flashlight ahead of me so that I could see her. She was still being dragged across the forest floor. I willed my legs to pump faster. I ducked under branches, leapt over logs, and narrowly avoided crashing into trees. Yet no matter how hard I worked my legs, no matter how much energy I expended in pursuit of the unknown beast, Margaret got further and further away. After a while, I could only see her head, still being smacked by the uneven ground. Not long after that, even her head disappeared, and I had only her screams to guide me. But those grew even fainter, and I realized that I would not be able to save her. When I couldn't run any longer, I stopped and bent over, gasping desperately for air. Margaret's screams continued to grow more distant before they abruptly ceased altogether. My head jerked up. I strained my ears, but I heard nothing. The forest was completely still. I was alarmed. If Margaret were still screaming, that meant she was alive. But now there was only silence, meaning... I shook my head. I refused to let my mind consider that gruesome possibility. But deep down, in the back of my mind, I knew what had happened to Margaret. I just couldn't admit it to myself. I started jogging forward, calling out her name in a harsh voice. "Margaret? Margaret, where are you?" I cried out. I suddenly noticed a new noise, one that wasn't there before. It was the sound of running water. I realized that I must be near the small stream that we had visited 2 days before. Picking up my pace, I walked towards the sound of the stream. My flashlight illuminated the path ahead, and I saw moving water. And then I saw Margaret. She was lying face down in the stream, her black hair waving gracefully in the eddies of the water. "Margaret!" I yelled as I sprinted towards her. As soon as I got within 5 feet of her, I stopped. My flashlight now lit up her entire body. There were cuts and bruises all along her legs and arms, and her clothes were tattered. Her right leg had 4 large cuts running down it, no doubt where the beast had been holding her. And her head was bashed in. A large rock lay next to the stream. It had bits of skin and brains still on it, where it had been used to crush her temple. One look into her eyes told me there was no life there. A dark current of blood had started washing down the stream. Margaret was dead. That thing, that beast, straight out of Walter McNeil's story, had crushed her skull. For a few seconds, I stood motionless. My flashlight focused on the lifeless body of one of my best friends. Then, I took a step backwards, turned around, and ran. It got Margaret. It got Margaret. That was all I could think as I sprinted back towards the clearing. It got Margaret, and now it's going to get us. We have to get away. The light from the fire guided me back towards the clearing. After what seemed like an eternity of sprinting, I arrived back at camp. Dry grass burns quickly, and the fire had mostly burnt out in the time I had been gone. Astor and Tony were huddled next to the ruined tent. Astor was rocking back and forth, and Tony sat next to her in a daze, his eyes unfocused and foggy. I approached them, and they both turned to look at me. "Get up, now. We have to go," I ordered. "Where's Margaret?" Tony asked in a voice that sounded very far away. "Margaret's gone. Let's go." It was a considerable effort to keep my voice calm. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Aster cried out. "She's fucking gone. Get up and go." This seemed to motivate Tony. He jumped to his feet and bolted towards the path that led back to Walter's house. I struggled to help Aster stand. Her knees were too weak to support her weight, and she had to lean on my shoulder. "Tony, wait!" Aster sobbed. "Just let him go. We need to leave. Walk with me," I commanded her. Slowly but surely, we managed our way towards the path. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any sign of danger, any sign of that thing. My anger was back. It had killed my friend, one of my best friends since childhood, and I hated it for that. I hated it with all my soul, but now was not the time for hate. I needed to ensure our survival. Margaret was gone, but we could still save ourselves. We entered the dark trail. I held my flashlight in my left hand as my right side supported Aster. The dirt path took a sharp curve, and we rounded it as quickly as we could. When we came fully around the corner, the bright beam of light from my flashlight revealed a grisly sight. Tony was up in one of the pine trees. His feet dangled about 4 feet from the ground. He had been completely impaled on the many branches that grew from the tree. Thinner, weaker branches had snapped off, but the thicker ones had held strong and penetrated his body. He had been forced completely up to the trunk of the tree. One branch protruded directly from the center of his neck. Another stuck out through the right side of his chest, revealing a horribly bent rib cage. His head hung downwards at an odd angle. All the pine needles nearby were speckled with blood, and a steady drip, drip could be heard as warm liquid spilled from his fresh corpse. I felt puke climb up in my throat, but I forced it back down. I grabbed Aster by the arm and gave her a rough pull. "Just keep walking. Don't look at him," I said in a shaky voice, but Aster wouldn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her face deathly white and her eyes wide with shock. "Aster, come on, we need to go now. We can still get away," I pleaded with her. She took 2 steps towards the body of Tony, and then ran the other way. "Stop! You're going the wrong way!" I cried out as I began to chase her. She didn't seem to hear me. Panic had taken hold of her, and no amount of instructions or logic could get through to her. I tore after her, but I was already exhausted from chasing after Margaret, and I couldn't keep up. Aster had always been a better runner than me. She sprinted across the camp clearing in a blind panic as I begged her to stop. When she disappeared into the woods at the opposite end of the camp, I followed her in. I ran after Aster the same way I had run after Margaret. I called out her name and begged her to wait. I had a sudden, terrible realization. Aster was in complete panic mode, following no clear path. The ridge we were on was only 100 meters wide, though, and had steep cliffs on both ends. With the overhead foliage blocking the moon and stars, a person running as quickly as she was might not see the edge in time to stop completely. I put my head down and ran faster than I'd ever run before. Aster seemed to be slowing down now, perhaps becoming tired. I was gaining on her, but then I saw something else through the trees ahead. Stars. My gut sank when I realized that my fears had been correct. The cliff was 20 yards in front of Aster. I was at least 10 more behind her. I put every bit of energy I still had into running and screamed, "Aster, you're going off the cliff!" Aster understood the danger, but it was too late. She tried to stop herself, but her shoes slipped on the rocky ground and she tumbled forward. I slowed down as fast as I could, no more than 2 feet from the edge of the cliff. I reached my hand out and swiped at her torso, trying to grab her arm. My head smacked against her shoulder, hard enough to spin her around, but I had nothing to grab onto. Her terrified eyes met mine, and she opened her mouth to scream. But her scream was taken by the wind, and she was gone. I stood on the edge of the cliff. I didn't dare look over the side. Oh shit. Oh shit, oh shit. I was alone now. All of my friends were gone. I was alone in the forest. Alone with it. Somehow, I still had the energy to run. I ran back towards camp as fast as my legs could carry me. I was determined to escape, to survive this all somehow. Through all this, I still had my flashlight in hand. It was a miracle I hadn't dropped it somewhere. I arrived back at the clearing. The grass fire had completely gone out. I made a straight line for the path that led out of the campground, a swell of panic rising in my stomach, but something stood in my way, directly in the entrance to the path. It was Tony. Tony stood in the path. His body had been taken down from the tree. The branches through his throat and chest were still there. They had been snapped off the tree, and blood still ran from the open wounds on his body. Behind him, I could see it. That thing that had dragged Margaret to her death. The thing that had impaled Tony upon the tree. The black, two-dimensional being that had terrorized us all. Strangely, it was kind of transparent. I could see it, but I could also see everything behind it. It held Tony's body up like a puppet. His head lolled to one side, and then turned upwards, looking at me with blank, dead eyes. Tony's mouth curved up into a grin, but it was not a grin of his own. It looked as if his cheeks had merely been forced upward by an outside force. And then Tony laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It sounded as if air was being forced through his mangled vocal cords by the thing holding him up. His smile dropped, and then he spoke. Except it wasn't Tony speaking. It was that thing speaking through Tony. The voice was so garbled that I could hardly understand it, but I made out a single word.
Run.
It dropped Tony's body on the dirt path and disappeared. Tony crumbled into a heap of useless flesh. He looked like an action figure that some angry toddler had crushed and stomped into the ground. It had told me to run, but Tony's body in the center of the path sent another clear message. Don't take the trail. So I ran. I ran into the woods next to the path. I planned on turning back towards the trail when I could, determined to make my way out of this forest from hell. But there it was, right beside me. It followed along with me, keeping pace easily. Every time I tried to turn in the direction of the path, it was there. It was not going to let me escape. Like a dog herding sheep, it ran beside me. It kept itself between me and the trail, ensuring that I could not make my way onto the dirt that led to safety. I absolutely knew, that if I ever crossed its path, I would be dead. I had no choice but to continue straight ahead through the thick forest of pines. It had changed now. It took on a more definite form. It was no longer transparent but pure black, as it was when it had taken Margaret. It was a beast with 4 long, thin legs that ended in huge claws. Its snout was lengthy and pointed, and its back was horribly arched. It lumbered along beside me, mad with thirst for the kill. I looked ahead and saw stars again. I was nearing the other edge of the ridge, and if I did not change direction soon, I would go over the edge, just as Aster had. I tried to curve my path to the left, away from the trail, but it was there too. It had disappeared from my right side and appeared on my left, continuing to herd me straight ahead. There was only one direction it wanted me to go. He taunts him, like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it. The words of Walter McNeil echoed through my mind as I ground to a halt, inches away from the cliff. I turned to face the horror that pursued me. My mind was completely empty. I had no more sense left in me. There was nothing I could do to protect myself. It stayed in the trees, several feet from the edge of the ridge, prowling back and forth like a giant cat as its hideously long claws scraped against the rocks on the ground. I didn't dare try to run anymore. Every potential path of escape was blocked. I saw its mouth open wide to reveal a set of monstrous black teeth. It curled back onto its hind legs and looked like a spring that was waiting to be set loose. Its hind legs thrust forward with enormous power, and it leapt at me from the trees. Sharp teeth bit painfully into my chest as it crashed into my torso and took me over the ledge. Walter McNeil awoke with the sun creeping over the horizon. He hadn't slept well, not well at all. Halfway through the night he had heard something awful, a horrible noise that seemed to come from the direction of the camp, where those kids were staying. He thought he dreamed it, but he wasn't completely sure. Stepping out onto his front porch, he pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. He felt uneasy. He couldn't quite place his finger on it, but something was throwing him off. For some reason, on this morning, he felt drawn to it. Drawn to that damn stairway that stood so defiantly over the ridge. Perhaps it was the horrible noise that had wakened him in the night, or perhaps it was the fact that there was no smoke creeping up over the nearby campgrounds, as it had the past 2 mornings while those kids were camping. Walter walked along the short, narrow path that led to the stairway. The rising sun illuminated it, and to him, it was beautiful. It looked just like it had when he was a boy. It was exactly how he remembered it. Walter placed his foot on the first step and began climbing. In his mind, he counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Any other man would be afraid to do such a thing. To climb out on an impossible stairway over a large cliff that looked as if it should fall over at any moment. But Walter knew it was safe. It had been there for 900 years and had not fallen over. At least that's what those archaeologists claimed. And he had climbed out on it when he was a boy, hadn't he? It hadn't fallen over then. No, the stairways would not falter to the weight of Walter McNeil. It had been there when he was born, and it would remain there long after he had died. Walter hesitated before taking the last step. Carefully, he raised himself onto the final step and peered out over the valley. It was a beautiful view, better than the one he enjoyed from his porch. The sun illuminated the valley below in a splendid swirl of colors. But suddenly, a darkness came over him. His skin tightened up and goosebumps broke out over his arms. This place was no good. He could feel that. For the first time in his life, he could tell that the stairway was not something he should disturb. Walter quickly rushed down the steps, taking them 2 at a time when he could. It wasn't until he was back on the trail to his house that he felt better. When the sense of darkness finally left him, he laughed out loud in the morning air. What an old fool he was! Scared of a stupid hunk of rock that some crazy Indians built 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, his mind returned to that feeling of dread that had overcome him on the top step of the stairway. He thought back to the story he had told those kids a few days ago. Walter shuddered and decided not to think about it any longer. He had lived in his house for 50 years and had not had a single whiff of the supernatural come from those stairs. Because it doesn't go after individual people, only groups. His subconscious goaded him. He shoved the thought out of his mind. That ridiculous story came from a superstitious old drunkard. It wasn't even worth considering. Stairway to heaven, my ass. But in his heart, He knew that nothing could completely wash away the fear he now felt towards that place. The fear that had invaded his soul and taken root, like a weed, as soon as he arrived at the final step of the stairway. He could ignore it, rationalize it, explain it away as best he could, but the seed of doubt would never leave him. Kids these days can't even count right. What good is school anyways? Yeah, that's it. They just miscounted. Couldn't see it right in the setting sun. That's what happened. That must be it, he said out loud, attempting to console himself. Yeah, that must be it, because there were exactly 40 steps on that damn stairway. Thank you for tuning in. If you like this story, hit that like button. Consider sharing and subscribing to the channel to be alerted to new uploads. If you'd like to see something specific on my channel, leave a comment below and I will look into it. Good night, everyone.